The Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra promises next level photography, so I put it to the test for 7 days, capturing different scenes, lighting conditions, and subjects. I'm Lishi, your tech pal from Down Under, and my question is this phone's camera really worth the hype? Let's find out. So day one, we started off pretty simple, at home in my studio. So this room has zero natural light, which is actually pretty sad, but it is the perfect way to shoot some photos of some product. I know a lot of people and small businesses use their phones for product shots. So does this live up to the standard that we all expect?
This definitely looks more blue.
My go-to typical product shot is a PlayStation 5 controller. I have a lot of them, they're very colorful, and they have the perfect shape to test out portraits. And it's also the first thing that I saw in my room to shoot. The S25 Ultra does have a new 50 megapixel ultra wide lens, which is great, as opposed to the 12 megapixel that the S24 Ultra has. But I started with the ultra wide lens to get real close to the back of that controller, as PlayStation do engrave the back plate with their shapes. And I think it held up pretty good. I will say, compared to the iPhone 16 Pro Max, the shot didn't feel as clear, but the S25 Ultra can definitely get closer to a subject and stay in focus. The saturation is pretty different between the two phones, especially when you compare the color of this desk in both shots. I don't think it's bad, but it is something that I noticed. So next was studio lighting. Like I said, the S25 Ultra does keep saturation at a higher level, especially with accent colors. For example, the pink lighting that I've got going on in these shots, it's definitely more punchy than compared to the iPhone. But the iPhone does highlight natural colors better, especially with the wooden tones of the wall panels. It feels a lot more warm and a lot more realistic. It's still not a bad shot though, but they are quite different. A common complaint people have with the Galaxy flagships is that they're not that great with low light photography. They say that the photos tend to be quite noisy in darker areas. It might be a little hard to show you in these photos, but if you do look at the cabinet behind me, where Spyro the Dragon statue is sitting, the blacks of that cabinet and Spyro, it does show a lot more noise and grain compared to the iPhone shot. I understand the background is not in focus, there is a blur, but you can still see that there is a bit of noise. And again, although it's blurry, the iPhone does show less noise and holds more contrast in the black tones. However, this phone does shine the most when it comes to portraits of product.
Tell me what the problem is between these two photos.
It perfectly cuts out the subject and separates that from the background. In my experience over the years, the iPhone has never done a good enough job of this. It does miss things, there's blur around the edges, and it's actually a reason why I swapped to Android. When the Google Pixel 4 came out, I jumped ship from iPhone to the Pixel because Android just takes a much nicer portrait for what I do for my job. Back then I was doing more product photography than what I do now, but my point still stands. Android does a better job. So overall, day one showed that this phone can do some great product shots in the right lighting. Portraits are great, it shines with color saturation if that's the look that you want to go for. But anything dark or contrasty, it will struggle a little bit.
Yes, I have two. I'm giving one away. You'll have to follow me on Instagram and be ready for that giveaway.
Day two is all about nature. Getting that natural light and experiencing the native bush of Australia, because having walking trails like this in your backyard is something that I definitely don't take for granted.
The reality of being in the Australian bush, bugs everywhere.
It's so special, and although there's not a lot of color here, it's still so special to explore. So what did we find? Well, not much to be honest, just a lot of browns and blue sky, the occasional green of some leaves. The only thing I can really say here is that, again, the shots do look more saturated, but I think it looks a lot nicer in daylight. So if you like that look, then you're going to love this. Where the phone does shine, again, is in its ability to zoom in. I'll touch more on this later in the video, but check these examples out. You might not see anything in the dirt on this 5x shot, but if you go to the 10x shot, there is a massive ant here. And you can see his face, his legs, the color is popping. It shows so much detail and it actually makes my skin crawl, but the way that it just shows enough detail at a 10x zoom is pretty impressive. That's not to say that the photo is perfect by any means, because it isn't, but it's still pretty impressive to have a 10x optical lens that looks this good, especially when the subject is moving really quickly, because that ant was trying to get away from me. Overall though, of course, it takes a nice natural light photo. Being outside, it looks gorgeous, but I do find that it does alter blue tones a bit too much to my liking with things such as the sky and water. Day 3, nightography. Samsung tend to harp on about their nightography quite a lot. And I just want to be very clear here. I went with the approach of shooting the sky and skylines, not necessarily low light photography. And by that, I mean, I didn't test scenarios of people sitting in like an outdoor bar with some accent light behind them. I went for the stars and I went for the sky. So here's what happened. I think it does a great job of brightening colors in the dark. Again, with the blue tones, it did bring out the color of the sky a lot more than what I thought it would. And in this scenario, I think it does look quite nice because it was almost pitch black. Of course, unrealistic, but it's a nice effect. So shooting the stars in dusk light, I think is nice. But when you are trying to shoot the stars in a darker sky, it does create an image that is very grainy and very artificial. It might be a little hard to explain, but if you look at this photo here, it looks like it's trying to make its own Milky Way. And I don't particularly think it looks nice. It just looks like a lot of grain. However, the iPhone, it does make the sky look a lot more blue, which I'm personally not fond of. I do prefer what the Samsung has done in keeping that black tone to the sky because it was pitch black outside. I think there are other phones out there that do a better job of shooting stars. And that's a hard thing to do because realistically, you'd want a proper camera, you'd want a proper lens, not really use your phone. However, it's not that bad. I think it does a pretty good job of shooting constellations, such as the frying pan is what we call it here in Australia, which I think it's called the chameleon constellation. It looks pretty clear. You can see it in the image. So overall, not my particular favorite. The long exposure, I understand the concept, but I think it just creates such an artificial looking photo depending on what you're shooting. I do feel like this will definitely be better in that scenario, like I said earlier, that I didn't shoot in, which is if you're at a bar or somewhere low light with a lot of accent lighting, maybe even a fire behind you. I think it could do a very good job of that. I just didn't have the opportunity to shoot that. Believe it or not, I'm very introverted. So day 4 was the city. I really wanted to go to Melbourne because I think we have such a beautiful city. We have such a beautiful city skyline. Unfortunately, the Yarra River is brown when it should be blue. So Council and Lord Mayor, I think we need to do something about that. But regardless, I really wanted to test the phone in this environment because the day was beautiful and there's so much beautiful blue color there. And I think that these photos just came out so gorgeous. All the blue tones are popping in such a nice way here. And I do think that my skin tone looks very natural for me. Portrait mode again worked really well here, especially with me. I think it did a great job of separating me from the background of the city buildings. It created enough depth to feel like it was not taken on a phone in a way, at least in my opinion. I think the image looks really nice. I would be really curious to see how it would shoot photos like this in that same environment on a much darker and gloomier day, because Melbourne can have every season in one day. And I'm just curious to see what it would do when it's raining. So day 5, macro photography. Something I never really do, because realistically, how often do we actually use this mode? I think it's a very cool photography mode, but the chances of me using it on my phone is very low. I never really use it. But I will give the S25 Ultra some credit because it does take a really nice macro shot with the little bits of glitter and things that I decided to set up. In fact, I think it's actually a little too good because you can see how dry the palms and the bottom of my fingers are in the photo, which is a little embarrassing. I didn't realize my hands were that dry. But flicking on the macro mode and turning it off, you do notice the lens changing, which I think is pretty cool. It shows that it is flicking into the ultra wide lens, and just seeing that happen, I don't know, I just think that's a cool thing to see when you are the photographer. But again, colors popping. I keep saying that throughout this video. The saturation is quite high, but I think in this scenario, I like it. I prefer it over the iPhone. This is gonna sound really strange, but I do think that the iPhone's photo of me holding the gemstones does make my hands look a little jaundiced, whereas the Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra does bring me more of a pink tone to my hand. And both of them are kind of unrealistic. However, I think the Galaxy does look more natural. It makes me feel a little bit more alive, and that is a weird thing to nitpick on, but it is something that I did notice. So macro mode is nice when you are taking photos of things like maybe bugs, plants, something that you do want to get close to and get a lot of detail. But I would wager that this mode doesn't really matter to a lot of people and is not the deciding factor on what phone you're going to buy. I mean, I could be wrong. It might mean something to you. So let me know in the comments if macro mode is something that you use a lot of, because I personally don't. But But moving on to day 6, which is my least favorite category, and that is selfies. I personally hate selfie cameras. I would much prefer to use a rear lens in 0.5 or 0.6 and take a photo like this. And that is just because I'm self-conscious of seeing myself up close. I personally think there is room for improvement when it comes to selfie cameras across the board. If companies could somehow integrate a wide angle or an ultra wide angle selfie camera, that would be a lot of fun. The quality might not be great, but I would prefer to have a much wider shot whilst being able to see myself. However, I think these photos look okay for what they are, but I don't have much of an issue with them other than the fact I just feel like it's too close for my liking, but depending on the lighting condition that you're in, it can be okay. I'm keeping this section small because, yeah, you can tell I'm really awkward about it. But day 7, that brings me to talk about zoom again, which I said I would touch on again in this video. And I did want to just collate all the stuff that I took over the 7 days because I did take different shots with different zoom lenses throughout the week in those different environments that we were in. And overall, I think the zoom is fine. This phone does have a 1x, 2x, 3x, 5x, and 10x optical zoom. I mean, you probably wouldn't call a 1x a zoom because that's standard. But anyway, once you go to 30 and once you go to 100, that is digital zoom. And I think even at 10 times, the phone does give you a pretty decent shot as what we saw earlier with that photo of the ant. In regards to the 30 times and 100 times zoom, for me, this is a case of just because we can doesn't mean we should. And the reason being, A, I'm not reaching for those focal lengths hardly ever. I am definitely the type of shooter that would rather get closer to a subject than zoom in with the phone. And secondly, you do notice that you start to lose some pretty important detail in the image. For me, the sweet spot is the 5x lens. I think that does provide an awesome photo in the right lighting conditions. It still holds enough detail, but the moment you start to go any further than 10, you start to lose my appreciation. Like I mentioned, my photography style is to get closer to a subject physically and probably shoot on 1x, maybe 2 if I feel like it, but it's usually 1x. So I would love to know what your shooting style is. Please leave a comment down below because I'm curious to see how different we are. So this has been a deeper look at what photos could look like on the Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra. Please let me know in the comments if you do want to see anything else when it comes to this phone, if you do want to see video. I ended up pre-ordering my own phone. I chose the jade green titanium. So once that arrives, we'll be doing much more because this one is actually a loan. I would much rather do some more with my own phone. That way we can make as much content as we like. Be sure to subscribe and I'll catch you next time.